What should be the biggest issue at the federal Canadian election is an issue that is not being discussed by a single federal party leader. Not Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, not Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney, not NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, not even any of the leaders of most of the smaller parties. This issue is incredibly important, and it's insane to me that federal Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre in particular is not talking about this issue, because the United Nations just released a condemnation of Canada's so-called assisted dying regime, our euthanasia regime. As many of you will know, Canada's expanding eligibility for dying at the end of a needle and doctor-administered assisted dying has been growing by leaps and bounds. Over 30,000 Canadians have died by lethal injection, and now we're seeing the eligibility consistently expand. It's the biggest election issue that nobody's talking about. Now, why is it such a big election issue? This isn't just an issue that only affects a handful of Canadians, even though increasingly the number of Canadians who have opted to die in this way is growing by leaps and bounds, and there have been so many horror stories about Canadians opting to die by lethal injection because they felt trapped into making that choice. In 2027, it is scheduled right now that assisted suicide for those struggling with suicidal ideation, assisted dying for those who solely have mental illness as an underlying condition, will come into effect across the country. Every single Canadian knows somebody who struggles with mental illness. I want everybody listening right now to think about the people or person in your life who struggles particularly with mental illness, whether that's an eating disorder, whether that's some form of depression, whether that's something even more severe like schizophrenia. But it could be as simple as a season of depression in that person's life. Or maybe it's you. Maybe you're the person watching this and thinking, I'm the person who struggles with that. Under these laws that will come in 2027, you could walk into a doctor's office and you would be eligible to die by lethal injection. You would be eligible not for suicide prevention, but for suicide itself. This is a slow-moving disaster that is headed inexorably in our direction, and we have the opportunity to stop it. And yet, no federal leader is talking about this issue at all in this election. Now, I understand that federal leaders want to focus on specific issues. Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney probably doesn't want to touch the issue because it's been a disaster, condemned even by the international press. But Pierre Poilievre has a real opportunity here to zero in on an issue where the public is on his side, where he can speak to the reality that Canada is broken. Well, how do we know this? Because so many Canadians have opted to die by lethal injection, by doctor-administered lethal injection, because they could not find housing, because they could not get disability funding, because they could not find the right treatments, because they simply couldn't get a psychiatrist or the proper mental health supports. And Pierre Poilievre's party put forward a bill banning assisted suicide for mental illness. That bill was put forward by British Columbian MP Ed Fast, and Poilievre himself voted for it. And if he wanted to bring this issue up, now is the time, because as I said, this should be one of the biggest Canadian election stories, and virtually nobody has touched it. Even the press has barely looked at it. But on March 21, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities published a report calling on Canada to repeal Track 2 MAID, I'll tell you what that means in a minute, and to put a halt to advance requests for assisted dying, which have been permitted in Quebec since October. So advance requests means that if you feel like you are declining, or you feel like there is a point in dementia or perhaps memory failure where you would no longer want to live, that you can sign a form to that effect, and that the doctors can use that form when you are later incapacitated and incapable of giving consent, and says, here's the paper that says this person wrote right here that they would want to die when they entered into this kind of condition, and so this is our legal grounds for eliminating them via lethal injection. And this has led to some real horror stories in other places. So there was a very infamous story in the Netherlands, for example, where an elderly woman had allegedly said that if she struggled with some form of dementia, that she would want to be euthanized. The The story is kind of messy because apparently she gave differing opinions on this, but a court agreed that what she had said in the past counted essentially as advance consent. And so because she was a lovely lady and because she had dementia but was enjoying her life in the nursing home, the staff at the nursing home didn't want her to be euthanized because she was playing games with the other residents and again seemed to have good quality of life. The doctor actually had to lace her tea or coffee, I forget which it was, I believe it was coffee, with a sedative to knock her out and then give her the lethal injection. But then she woke up partway through and her family had to pin her down while the doctor gave her the lethal injection. And this case was analyzed by the courts, which basically confirmed that they had done nothing wrong. So this is the kind of hell that advance requests take us to. And this is advance request was specifically condemned here by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Think about how badly you have to screw up as a country to get a condemnation from the United Nations. So just to give you a little bit of background for this, so what's Track 2 MAID? What is the UN really honing in on their condemnation of Canada, which globalist Mark Carney should be particularly appalled about, but isn't saying a word about? So assisted dying for terminally ill Canadians with reasonably foreseeable death was legalized in 2016 via Bill C-14. And then in 2021, the Trudeau government legalized what is referred to as Track 2 MAID. And basically what this did was it expanded the eligibility of assisted suicide to those with disabilities or incurable illnesses who were experiencing suffering but no longer had a reasonably foreseeable death. So basically they walked up to the safeguards, they ripped them out, and it was like, well, if you're suffering, then you're essentially going to be eligible. Your death doesn't have to be reasonably foreseeable. This has produced horror stories like the story in Calgary, where a 27-year-old autistic woman was fighting her dad in the courts because she wanted to get a lethal injection, and he desperately wanted her to stay alive because she shopped around for doctors to sign off on her euthanasia. She won the case, he lost. That's the kind of country that Track 2 MAID has created. And according to government data, more than 1,300 people were killed under Track 2 MAID between 2021 and 2023. I hate using the phrase MAID. I think it's a garbage Orwellian term that's deliberately intended to disguise what's actually going on here, which is euthanasia, which is assisted suicide. But YouTube flags the phrase suicide, so I'm going to try and temper my usage of the term, but I want to make clear that that is the correct term. And the reason that euthanasia activists don't want us to use that term is because they know it triggers people, because virtually every Canadian knows somebody who has struggled with those kinds of thoughts before, or even struggled with that sort of ideation before. So Megan Gilmore reported on this UN story in the Canadian Affairs publication, but I've seen it pretty much nowhere else. A number of government representatives and civil society organizations convened in Geneva, Switzerland in early March. And they convened at the United Nations to discuss Canada's compliance with the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Canada's been party to since 2010. So essentially, Canada is a signatory to this convention upholding the rights of peoples with disabilities. And although Canada is party to this convention, we really have these patchwork laws across the provinces. And so the implementation of laws protecting the rights of peoples with disabilities has been very inconsistent across the country. Now, several groups in Canada who have been ignored entirely by the Trudeau government, all these disability rights groups, suicide prevention groups, mental health groups have been begging the government to reverse course. And it is one of the great mysteries of Canadian politics as to why all of these groups, many of whom are progressive, not socially conservative in any way, have basically been written out of the process and ignored entirely. And so finally, in what amounts to an act of desperation, groups like Inclusion Canada wrote to the committee at the UN to raise concerns about Canada's expanding euthanasia regime, raising concerns that this was essentially in violation of the committee, in violation of the Convention on the Rights of Peoples with Disability, and that Track 2 MAID, quote, violates the right to life for people with disabilities, which is a pretty chilling statement. And again, if it bleeds, it leads in the press, as the old saying goes. But for some reason, when it's people with disabilities and when it's in a bombshell condemnation by the United Nations, you're getting crickets from the media on this, pardon me. So Canadian government representatives also attended to basically defend the regime that the Trudeau government has implemented, primarily under, by the way, Justice Minister David Lametti, who has never met a euthanized corpse he didn't approve of. And in fact, he opposed the original legislation in 2016 because it didn't go far enough. Pushing for MAID for mental illness was one of his pet projects. And although, thankfully, he isn't in cabinet, he was handpicked by Mark Carney to assist in the transition, Mark Carney's transition from citizen of the world to resident to the Prime Minister's office. And so the Canadian government reps basically showed up at the UN to defend everything Canada has been doing. And they highlighted actually the Ottawa Disability Inclusion Action Plan, which was created to assist people with disabilities. But this is such a joke, and people have such a difficult time getting access to the care they need, that the UN committee was not at all convinced. I want to emphasize here, this is a UN committee. The UN committees are not stacked with conservatives. So this is a really big story. This is essentially a very progressive international group looking at what Canada is doing and saying, this is a really big problem. Like, this euthanasia train is a runaway train. You need to throw the brakes on. And yet none of the federal leaders are talking about this, right? The NDP should be going nuts. I thought they stood for the little guy. Mark Carney should be appalled that a regime implemented by a government he advised and has now succeeded is condemned for essentially violating the rights of people with disabilities. And Pierre Poilievre actually voted for legislation to stop the expansion of euthanasia eligibility, which, as I'll get to, is something that the UN is now calling on Canada to do. So the UN is calling on Canada to do something that Pierre Poilievre has already voted for. This fits perfectly into his messaging about how Canada is broken, but for some reason he's not talking about it. So Rosemary Caius, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, the vice chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, actually asked Canada's government representatives how it was possible to view Track 2 MAID as, quote, not a step back into state-sponsored eugenics. So remember, I've mentioned this before on the Bridgehead briefing, that the Toronto Star has actually referred to Canada's euthanasia regime as Hunger Games-style social Darwinism. Well, now, in an echo of that language, you've got the vice chair of the committee, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, asking how we can't look at our system and conclude this is state-sponsored eugenics. And then she followed that up by asking, how is Track 2 MAID not state-sponsored euthanasia? Well, of course it is. That's exactly what it is. And as the Canadian Affairs noted, Kaya has also informed the committee or informed Canada's government representatives that the committee had, quote, heard about people with disabilities applying for MAID because they struggled to meet their basic needs. This story, unfortunately, has repeated itself right across the country almost since 2016 when Bill C-14 became law. And so the committee's conclusion was just a stunning and comprehensive rebuke of Canada's assisted suicide laws. And I think of that really stomach-churning, gut-wrenching moment when Justin Trudeau got elected in 2015 and said, Canada is back. If you had told him then that at the end of his tenure, we would actually get condemned by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities for violating their fundamental right to life because of policies that he brought in and championed, I think he would have called you a liar. But that's how steep the slippery slope Canada's plunge down is. So here's what Megan Gilmore reported in Canadian Affairs. In its recommendations, the United Nations took aim at Canada's decision to legalize Track 2 MAID. Track 2 MAID was legalized in 2021 after a lower Quebec court, it's always Quebec, ruled that restricting MAID to people with reasonably foreseeable deaths was unconstitutional. The committee noted with concern that the federal government never appealed that decision. They didn't. The Trudeau government just let it happen. They decided not to push back at all. The Quebec decision fundamentally changed MAID laws, the UN committee wrote. It assumes that suffering is inherent to disabilities themselves and not caused by the barriers people with disabilities face. The committee also said that the emphasis of personal choice in discussions about MAID creates a false dichotomy, something many of us have been saying for years. The Canadian government will provide suffering people with disabilities access to death without making sure they have what they need to live, the commission wrote. This is 100% true. This is what many of us condemning Canada's MAID regime have been saying for years. And this is such an opportunity for the federal Conservative Party to stand up for vulnerable people, to stand up for people with disabilities, to stand up for people struggling with mental illness, and to speak for those who are going to be directly victimized by what's coming in 2027 unless it gets stopped. And I think Canadians understand, when it's communicated clearly, that if we enter a legal regime where somebody is suicidal but is ruled by the government as competent to make their own decision, that there is nothing a family can do to stop them from walking into a hospital and applying for and then achieving medical aid and dying. That instead of medical institutions preventing people from killing themselves, from giving them the prevention that they need, instead, they will facilitate the process necessary to ensure that that person will be successful. A huge number of attempts fail. They will not fail once we're talking about doctor-administered lethal injections. And so in further condemnation, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability called on the Canadian government to do the following: halt Track 2 MAID, stop the scheduled 2027 expansion of assisted suicide eligibility to those whose sole condition is mental illness. Again, I cannot believe nobody is talking about this. And to stop proceeding forward with so-called advance requests for assisted suicide, and then also to refrain from permitting assisted suicide for so-called mature minors, which, by the way, groups such as Dying with Dignity have been pushing. And in response to a request for comment on the UN recommendations from Canadian Affairs, Health Canada, that's the government, merely reiterated that the current framework exists as it is, and then also noted the planned 2027 expansion. So they responded to the UN's recommendations that this be stopped by saying, yeah, we're going ahead with this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Conservative MP Ed Fast put forward a bill to ban assisted suicide for those with mental illness in 2023, but it lapsed at the end of the parliamentary session. And the public backlash to MAID for mental illness was so strong that despite how enthusiastic Justice Minister David Lametti was about this, it was delayed 2 times, pushed to 2027. But what this is the Trudeau government, and maybe the Carney government as well, their attempt to boil the frog more slowly. That basically, because so many horror stories were coming out and so many organizations were issuing like comprehensive condemnations about what the Canadian government was trying to do, they're like, we better slow this down. Because if they'd been listening to the disability rights groups, the suicide prevention groups, the psychiatric groups, the mental health support groups, they would have said, all right, we'll scrap this. Instead, what they said is we need more time to prepare. What? For the massive influx of mentally ill people who now have a very easy way to kill themselves? That's insane. So you know what the government is planning to do, because otherwise they wouldn't have delayed, they just would have canceled, which they did not do. And the Conservative Party did a brilliant job advocating for Fast's bill. Even in the Southern Ontario county where I live, the local member of parliament hosted a town hall that was packed in one of the Legion halls, and there was 4 Conservative MPs there who were talking about why this was so deadly. And in fact, they insisted on using language like killing as opposed to MAID. And one of the MPs shared his own struggles with mental health to emphasize how dangerous and how predatory this expansion actually is. And so the Conservatives have the language. I've heard them use it, and I do not know why they're not taking what is an international news story about Canada's government being condemned by the United Nations for pushing something that Conservatives are already on the record opposing, and why they're not running on that now. Because this really is an existential crisis for people struggling with mental illness. The number of people that I know personally who have struggled with mental illness and suicidal ideation would take me a very long time to list. Just last week, I was at a pro-life conference, and a young woman who had attempted suicide 7 times while she was young shared her story and then said, under this regime, the one that the Liberal government is currently planning to bring in as of 2027, I would not be here because I had the competency to plan my exit, but I didn't have the means to get it done. And under this, I would have the means to get it done. And now, as a 28-year-old successful young woman, she says, I now know there are 2 lies mental illness told me. One of them is that I would live with suffering forever. And she's like, I've lived long enough now to know that that's not true. And second of all, that a life with suffering isn't worth living. But she had to live long enough to recognize that depression was telling her lies. Under the current proposed Liberal plan coming our way in 2027, women like her would have been taken out of hospitals in coffins already, because she had the will to commit suicide. She would have been judged competent under the law to request it and be approved for it. She just didn't have the means to get it done. And our government is offering people like her the means to get it done. Now, despite how frustrating it is to see this story not get any traction from the politicians and the press, it is good news that the UN has delivered this very ringing condemnation, because it's a fundamental recognition of what some of us have been saying for a long time. It's a fundamental validation of what disability rights groups have been saying now for years. And Krista Carr of Inclusion Canada told Canadian Affairs, "We are absolutely thrilled. In many ways, this really vindicates the community who have been fighting this all along." But then, of course, Dying with Dignity, which is the most sinister group in the country, second only maybe to the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, which also, of course, champions lethal injections for the vulnerable. They predictably totally dismissed the concerns. So the United Nations, the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, issues a strong condemnation. What's Dying with Dignity's response? Well, they basically dismissed all the concerns and the lived experiences of Canadians with disabilities by insisting in a press release that, quote, "The effect of structural vulnerability on the lives of Canadians is a valid concern, but repealing MAID is not the solution." No, banning MAID would be the right solution. Again, what these people are pushing for, it's genuinely predatory. And you don't just have to take that from somebody like me, who is a social conservative, who knows and loves enough people who struggle with mental illness, to view this 2027 development as a genuine threat to the lives of people I truly care about. You can take it from the United Nations. You can take it from progressive rights groups. But for Dying with Dignity, they've never met a problem they didn't think a lethal injection was the solution to. Again, not a single federal party leader has addressed this stunning UN report. I just checked before the time of shooting. If that changes by the time this airs, I will be very happy to do a follow-up video on this. Prime Minister Carney has said nothing. Presumably, he supports the previous Trudeau government's policies. But if Pierre Poilievre were to come out, highlight this report, and push him on it, and Mark Carney were to back down, that would be a wonderful result as well. I just want this to get stopped. I want the idea of offering death to those struggling with ideation. I want that to be eliminated. The Conservative Party has already been very good on this issue, but they're not bringing it up now. When again, this isn't some niche social conservative issue. This is an issue that faces every single Canadian family. And if you thought the stories we've heard so far have been awful, just wait till you hear the stories that will happen when Canadians 18 and up will have achieved the right to die by lethal injection, by doctor-administered, government-funded lethal injection, and their parents are helpless to stop them. We're already starting to see these cases. We already saw a father in Alberta who was blocked from stopping his 27-year-old autistic daughter's planned assisted death. We will see so many more stories like that. For nearly a decade, the tragedies of Canada's assisted suicide regime have made international news, and now the UN has not only condemned that regime, but called on the Canadian government to reverse course. Why have the federal leaders not responded to this? Why has Pierre Poilievre not taken this opportunity to defend the vulnerable and reiterate a view he obviously already holds? For the Conservatives, this is a unique opportunity to stop further tragedy and to save real lives and to campaign on their already stated position on this issue. And for Carney, if he so desires, it's a chance to jump off a speeding train set into motion by his predecessors. I am completely serious when I say that the planned 2027 expansion of assisted death to those with mental illness poses the greatest threat to vulnerable Canadians in my lifetime. Without doubt. Federal leaders have a responsibility to address this issue, and so far we've heard nothing. Maybe it's because the press is ignoring the issue. Maybe some of them haven't even heard about it, but it's criminal, and they should be talking about it because desperate Canadians need assistance, not suicide. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the Bridgehead briefing. On this episode in particular, I'm going to ask you to share this with as many people as you can. Share it with your MPs. Send the message out there. There are too many people who are not aware of what is going on in Canada and what threats to the mentally ill and those who struggle with disabilities or other mental illnesses face. We need to raise awareness about this. There is still time in this election campaign for the Conservatives to start talking about it. So if you could like, share, subscribe, do all of those kinds of things and push the message out to as many people as you can. Thanks so much.